Thanks, Richard. I think it might be useful just to start by just very briefly just sharing a little bit about where this change of role comes from, and I suppose what I'm hoping to help the Synod achieve in the next couple of years in this role as transformation director. In a sense, this comes out of some challenges and frustrations about the number of ideas that are coming to us, both from individual churches, from groups of churches, and from some of the challenges that the Synod itself faces around new ideas about how we do things differently in terms of the use of our resources, our buildings, our finances, and how we can provide some capacity to stimulate some actions rather than just having lots of bright ideas. And really that's what I'm going to be taking a lead on, working to a reference group drawn from this group and from the various areas. And really, to me, part of what I'm hoping to do this evening is not so much talk to you, but to try and stimulate some discussion, to pick up some of the ideas that are already around, and particularly 2 or 3 themes that came from the valuable work of the facilitation group over the last 6 months and the discussions in Synod meeting, and start to try and help me shape some of the thinking around that. And I will give us an opportunity to go into breakout groups at various points, but really just by starting as a starting point, I would want to just remind us of our Synod principles that we've adopted some time ago about our use of resources, about the priority being to use them for God's mission, about the strong helping the weak, and then, if you like, we're in a mutual partnership working together under God's guidance. I was interested in Richard's devotions in his use of the parable of the talents. It's interesting. Over the last year, of course, the lectionary gospel has been Luke, and quite late in the year, I came to in preparing for a service, I came to a piece of work that talked about how through the gospel, in many of the stories and parables, Luke is trying to intertwine 3 key messages. Firstly, about the problem of riches and what you do with riches. Secondly, how Jesus reaches out to those who are outcasts or sinners in old terms in his society, and how that faith in Jesus has to lead us to actions in new life. And really, for me, those 2 things are important challenges to us as a Synod in how we use resources, but equally importantly, recognizing the very significant resources that many individual churches have. And certainly when you start collecting them together in groups of churches in missional partnership, very significant levels of resources, about how we are using those well in pursuit of those aims. So some of the things we may well discuss today are about how we use the resources we have collectively as a Synod. But I think equally it's important that we think how they apply to us in our local context, our local churches, our local partnerships, and how we, maximize the value of what we have together. So I'd just like us to spend, and I think we'll drop in and out of breakout groups for sort of 5-10 minutes, 2 or 3 times in the next hour. I'd just like us just to spend a quick 5 minutes in some breakout groups, just reflecting on those principles and what they say to how we should be using resources and how we can bring resources together to help in our work. Okay, that was, if you like, just a bit of a warm-up exercise, so we're not going to take any feedback on that. I want to take us into the first of the pieces of work from piece of feedback from the facilitation group, which is around investment and grants. And I want to just sort of share back, and apologies to those who know far much more than I do about the details of the facilitation group's discussions, who are with us today. But I want to just take us back to 2 or 3 slides from that. So again, I will share my screen. You can now see slide 60, what says question 16, which is about investment and support for major mission projects. When we talk about Synod grants, I think it's fair to say that the majority of time we're talking about relatively small sums of money, probably in the low to mid tens of thousands of pounds. Sometimes they're for the employment of a worker, but more often they're to do with small scale building improvements to make the premises more fit for the sorts of activities that you're using them for now. Every now and again, and we've had 2 or 3 over the last 5 years, which are very much more significant. We're talking about 6-figure sums split between resources from the local church, external funding, and contributions from the Synod's Trust, which are really major mission redevelopment work. And I think we do need to think differently going forward about how we approach those 2 types of grants. The major thing, as the feedback from the facilitation group rightly suggests, requires a different approach that is about advice, training, about a more active involvement. We've talked about funding project managers, we've talked about funding feasibility studies, those sorts of things. But I want to focus in your next part of discussion more about the general Synod grants, and particularly about what we might call mission grants. So these are things that are about improving your church's mission potential. They're not about the maintenance and repair of the buildings, but some of them might be about improving your buildings. There is a separate piece of work that finance colleagues are starting on now to look at the process by which grant applications are made and making it simpler and more easy to navigate. Certainly part of that is that I hope that we can think of and we can identify and agree certain priorities for grants where we can have a much lighter touch approach to the awarding of small grants. And I think the way we've approached the warm hubs or warm and welcoming spaces grants this autumn, where we've provided small grants simply on the basis of a church having entered into a public commitment to offer a warm and welcoming spaces, is a sort of approach that I'd like to see us being able to use going forward for certain projects. But really what I want us to think about today is about not so much about the the key themes and the processes, but actually about what are the priorities. Of course, churches should be able to, I'd want them to be able to fund activities that are relevant to them in their community. But sometimes we might want to have a theme whereby we are saying, actually, we would particularly welcome grants in this field of work. You know, we are, as a synod, in the process of being assessed for eco-synod status at the moment. Many churches have already got eco-church accreditation. And at the synod meeting, Kate Gray brought us a set of resolutions around responding to the current cost of living or poverty crisis and seeking our support for the work of Church Action on Poverty. And there is a piece of work that needs to go forward about how we create a longer term programme of support through and with churches for responding to those issues of poverty. And those might be ideas or illustrations of where a different approach to grants that is about the synod identifying particular themes and allocating sums of money to those themes as a means of demonstrating our priorities as a synod and encouraging churches to think about how they respond in those particular areas could sit alongside a more general approach to grant giving. So what I'd like you to do in the next 10 minutes, and we will take a bit of feedback from this, is to think about a question that is, if the synod were to identify, you know, a sum of, let's say, £100,000 across churches for a priority for the next 12 months for grant giving to local churches, what should that priority be? And how could that money best be used to stimulate action and activity in local churches in support of that priority? So we'll give people 10 minutes in breakout groups, and then we will take a little bit of feedback, but equally, if somebody in the group could take some notes and feed them back to me later, that would be much appreciated as well, because we have got a bit of time, but not hours and hours tonight. So we'll give you 10 minutes in breakout groups to consider, you know, priority programs for synod grants and how those grants could best be given to stimulate activity and action at a local level.
Okay, welcome back, folks. We've got all 50 back now. As Lawrence put in the chat, we'll go through each of the groups, and if one person can feedback from each group one point, we're not able to discuss each point, but if you can just make a brief response, maybe the number one point that was made in your group, and then feel free, if one of you can write down any other points and send them to Mike, that would be really helpful. So we'll start with group one. I've no idea who was in each group, but I'll just hope that you pop up and say your bit. Group one. If you remember your group number, of course, that's the presumption.
Group one had Annette Wilkinson, Jill Turner, Gordon Bell, Johnny Hill, and Kate Gray in it.
Thank you, Lawrence. Who's the first to hit the unmute button?
Okay, hi, I'm Annette Wilkinson, and I was in group one.
Thank you.
Some of the things that came out of our group are whether the money should actually be spent on employing people to actually assist the church to find out what our needs actually are. With a lot of churches, you've got a growing older population, and it's kind of to assist to find what our goals should be by working with us and the local community. Other ones, so that was supporting the growth of local discipleship, having people assess our carbon footprint, and to help us with the immediate response to the poverty and cost of living. Those are the things that came up.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you very much. Group 2.
Do I have to?
Go, Graham. You're the first to unmute.
Yeah, we got a little bit stuck in a constructive way of saying this really needs to come from the local churches, and then we couldn't work out exactly what we as local churches could see ahead of us, other than grabbing hold of the warm hub idea. If there's another idea coming from another group that grabs people's interest, we'd be very happy to accept it, probably. There was something about solar panels, there was something about insulation, there was something about reducing carbon footprints, but nothing particularly specific, and I hope I've missed out or misrepresented anybody.
Thank you, Graham. As I say, you can always add to that and send it to Mike. Group 3.
Yes, in our group, what we were looking, I think the bottom line with it was community outreach. To get, because of the declining numbers in our churches, that how do we encourage people to come back in? Do we look at doing things differently? That was one of the things that was raised, the way in which our approach is. So, and the thing was that obviously we've got Margaret that was in Bispham to us here down in Swinton. And when we compared things that were going on within our churches, they were very similar. And it's also how do we get people to come in, because it's always seems within the churches that it's the same few people doing the same things most of the time, and it's how long can you sustain such intensity at that level. And you need those new people, you need new blood to come in as well, but it's not coming in at the rate that we were actually losing people.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reality of it, and that's the other thing. Is the big question is how do we get the community involved? How do we approach it? And it's not always the money that's going to do that. I don't think at the end of the day. It might help in certain ways, depends how we approach it. But I think many of you might be nodding your heads and thinking the same way. Well, my church is very similar to that. I don't know. But that's one in Blackpool, one here in Swinton.
Thank you, Paul.
Please forgive me if I've hoped I've got that right.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. We might just not be able to take every single group because of time constraints, but if people can, make sure they do feedback. I don't want to shut people up, but we're equally a bit tight on time. Group 4.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you, Mike.
Very quickly, we would just like to share a reflection on the principles, which leads us then to answering the question. It struck me for the first time when Mike was talking about the Synod principles. I think we perhaps tend to hear them as our priority is God's mission, and we all nod and say yes, of course. The strong should help the weak, and maybe we interpret that as strong churches helping weaker churches, whether that be financially strong or other ways of being strong and weak. And then we hear the last one as because we're all in this together, and all that sounds good. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But it struck me when Mike was speaking, and it really, I suppose it should have struck me years ago, that if our priority is God's mission, then our immediate focus should be looking outwards. So the second one then can no longer be, this is about bigger churches helping smaller churches, or wealthier churches sharing with poorer churches. If our focus is immediately outwards, that statement then says to me in the current context that it's the church that is financially strong, and we are being called to help the financially weak. And that for me then really changes how we understand that priority statement. And the third one stays as, because we're all in this together, it's that we're together with our community, not together in our church bubble. And I think that could be helpful to start trying to understand those mission statements in that way, which led on to us then saying, I think that the difference between these grants for the Warm Hub and grants as we've done them previously is this is a mission grant that immediately funds a project that people outside the church will feel the benefit of. And other grants have perhaps been grants to help us to make improvements in order that we then feel ready to do mission. This grant actually makes us do mission straight away. There's an immediate benefit to those not within our churches. So I think that's what we then want to say in answer to Mike's question about what should priority of grants be. Grants that actually make an immediate difference outside of our walls should be our priority.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to leave it at that point, and we're going to go into breakout rooms again in a minute or two, and then I'll work back from group 8 for the second lot of feedback. So every group has had the opportunity. For groups 5, 6, 7 and 8, please make sure that you report back your points to Mike through whoever's agreed to take notes. Hope that's all right. Mike, I'm going to hand back to you.
Okay, thank you. Some really interesting points in those short bits of feedback, which we can certainly pick up. And I think one of the things that I think for me is coming out of this is some really helpful ideas about areas where we need to look at putting on some other events as we go forward, to look at particular aspects of this in more detail. Right, I'm going to very quickly move on to another area from the facilitation group's feedback, which was about how we use resources from church closures. And there's a little bit of sort of background that I want to just share before we go into breakout groups again. The current approach that the trust, who are the custodian of the buildings, has been to sell the buildings, and then the money is reinvested in the work of the Synod, and particularly in grants to support local churches. We've had some discussions in the past about whether, in particular circumstances, buildings can be retained for wider use, and that was as you'll see from this slide, a significant theme from the feedback from the facilitation group's work. Part of the reason why the trust has traditionally taken a view on selling the buildings is that it is incredibly costly, both in terms of finance and also in terms of time, in retaining an empty building whilst work is done to identify a future use of it. Just simply the insurance costs for minimal fire and third-party coverage, is several times what you pay in your annual insurance premium as a church. And I know many of you think you pay far too much as your annual insurance premium for your church. There are also obligations that require us to, inspect the building on a weekly basis, and so on and so forth. So that has been the traditional approach, and certainly, I think, we have many buildings that are important assets in their community, and I fully understand the idea that's about future use. But if a church is closing at a point where, unless there is something obvious that is going on already or has already been set up, we've probably missed the boat. So what I want to ask you to think about in your groups is, if we were to move to a situation where an approach where we did retain some more of our buildings. What are the things that would need to, that local churches around that closed buildings would need to do, working with the community to make that a reality? What are the practical things that local churches could contribute to help that go forward? Because otherwise the costs to us outweigh the benefits that we might be able to give to the local community from that. So a bit of a discussion thinking about the practical use of church buildings for mission, and particularly church buildings where the congregation is very small or where the church building has closed. How can other local churches in the area help that process, help that building to continue to be available for use by the community?
Due to time constraints, I'm really sorry to groups 5 and 7. We're going to take a response from group 8 and 6, and those in 5 and 7 can hurl something heavy at me next time they see me.
Yeah.
So apologies for that, but please make sure you do feedback via Mike's email address, somebody from each group. That would be really helpful, because we do want to hear feedback generally. Just that time has gone on tonight, but it's been a good discussion. So if somebody from group 8 and then group 6 could feedback briefly, that would be really appreciated. Lawrence, you might want to remind people who's in those groups.
Yep. Room 8 is the one that has Leslie Husselby and Jill in it.
I'm going to report back then. In our group, we've got quite a lot of experience of churches closing, and sometimes that's been the really best thing to happen, because the congregation there have got tired and couldn't afford the building because it was needing lots of money. There have been cases, such as in Blackpool, where a church was bought by a dance group and now it's lively, lots of children running around. Some had grade 2 listed buildings which they couldn't afford, and wished almost that they could have rented somewhere else where they could carry on their mission. But we also thought that sometimes, occasionally, you have churches where mission is happening by people maybe not in the church, where it would be a good thing to continue it.
Thank you, Leslie. Group 6.
Group 6 was had Dalian and Daniel Harris in it.
I think I will feedback. We had the example of Leyland URC that, I mean, the Synod supported immensely, and they in the middle of the town, and they took their wooden doors away and it's glass doors and a cafe, and it made a huge difference. But I think overall we all agree that you can have the best building, the best project, but at the end of the day, it's relationships that is the important thing. So for us, we feel like we would rather ask the Synod to invest in people. For example, maybe a community and family worker or pioneer worker, or somebody who can help churches with admin so that it can free them up for doing the mission. Yeah, so or whatever that steering group in that partnership decide what the mission is. In some areas, it's a caseworker for refugees, or so for us, yes, buildings is important, but definitely relationships are more important. And if the Synod can help us support workers to help building the relationships, that will be better.
Thank you, Dalian. I'm going to hand back to Mike.
Thank you all for your contributions. There's been some really interesting feedback, and I'm more than happy to have notes and comments from the other groups by email as we go forward. I think one of the things that struck me is there are 3 or 4 at least themes that have come out of some of those feedbacks where I'm thinking, yeah, this is something where perhaps working with my mission mentor colleagues, we need to look at putting some specific sessions on to help people and to help develop our thinking around some of these and help us to work with you on those. So that's certainly an action I'm taking away from this. I think one of the things I found really interesting, and thank you to him for this, was Mike Walsh's suggestion in his feedback in the first part of feedback we had about the idea that mission grants should be provided where people outside the church benefited. And I just want to, apparently we haven't got the technology to do a poll, so we're going to have to do the green and red reactions button. So I would quite like to just take the temperature of people's views. If you warm to Mike Walsh's suggestion that we should focus mission grant on projects that have a direct benefit to people outside the church, could you indicate using the green tick? And if you're not so warm to it, could you use the red no button? So just give it a couple of minutes.
I don't have a red tick facility, so I'll just put my hand up.
There's a strong consensus on the green ticks on that. So thank you. That's something we'll pick up in terms of the work we do around grants. That's very helpful. Thank you, Mike, for that thought as well. Okay, so as I say, I'm part of my actions is I'm going to look at some other sessions around these sorts of things that we've discussed and started on a journey on today in the new year. And so on that basis, and because we promised we'd finish by 9, I'm going to hand back to Richard for some closing devotions. But thank you all for your time and your thoughts this evening.
Thank you, Mike. I just want to say huge thanks to Mike for planning and leading us through that item. From the messages I've had, private messages I've had from 1 or 2 of you on the chat, people have appreciated the opportunity. And I think the chat that Lawrence, Mike and I have had in between the feedback has been that we need to have perhaps more groups and times for discussion like this in order that we can harness a wider sort of consultation and breadth of opinion. So that's been really helpful. So thank you for that. I want to thank Ruth Watson as well, because she's been taking notes behind the scenes as well. I hope she hasn't been doing too much during the bit that's been recorded, but appreciate you volunteering to do that, Ruth. Thank you for that. I mentioned at the beginning about the Lysic prayer, and I'm going to suggest we use that as our closing prayer this evening before we log off. So I shall share screen again, and if you feel you are able to join in this prayer, then please feel free to do so. So we'll say this prayer. Feel free to unmute or mute or remain muted as you feel you want to. I know it will be a cacophony of sound, but God will be pleased with it nonetheless. So let us pray together. God of mission, who alone brings growth to your church, send your Holy Spirit, vision to our plan, wisdom to our actions, oil to our worship, power to our witness, help my church to grow in numbers, spiritual commitment to you, service to our Lord, Jesus Christ, our Lord.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yes, green.